he was not, as the endless stream of romanticized myths and pop culture iconography might suggest. Born a destitute peasant starving in the dust, or an oppressed laborer yearning for scraps. His revolutionary zeal was not forged in the desperate fires of personal poverty, but rather in the complex crucible of intellectual curiosity and a deep-seated, unwavering moral conviction. Born in June 1928, he entered a world of relative comfort as a member of Argentina's respectable middle class in the city of Rosario. His lineage was a complex and storied mix of aristocratic Spanish blood and a rebellious streak of Irish heritage that he would often credit for his fighting spirit. This was not the typical origin story for a man who would eventually become a global icon of proletarian struggle. He was known affectionately to his family as Ernestito, a diminutive name that belied the monumental and fearsome reputation he would one day earn across the globe. The story of his life is not one of rags to riches, but of privilege to purpose. It is the alchemical, often painful transformation of Ernestito, the asthmatic medical student, into Che, the hardened guerrilla, the Marxist ideologue, and the enduring symbol of uncompromising rebellion. If you find this intricate journey from the comforts of privilege to the bloody realities of revolution compelling, and if you want to support our deep, unvarnished dives into the complex figures who shape the modern world, please take a moment right now to help our channel grow. Click that like button to let us know you're engaged with this in-depth content. Hit subscribe. And ring the bell so you never miss a chapter of our ongoing historical analysis. And most importantly, share this video with friends, family, or anyone who believes that history is more than just dates and names. It is a vital lesson for the present. Your support is the absolute fuel that allows us to continue this mission of educational storytelling. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna was raised in an environment defined by intense intellectual curiosity and a defiant, almost bohemian spirit, despite their fluctuating middle-class status in Rosario and later Altagracia. His family was not wealthy in the traditional sense of the landed aristocracy that ruled Argentina, but they were deeply educated, culturally sophisticated, and socially connected. His father, Ernesto Guevara Lynch, was a restless, somewhat eccentric entrepreneur, businessman who tried his hand at various ventures, including construction and a yerba mate plantation. These ventures were often precarious. The family's finances were a constant source of instability, forcing them to move frequently. This financial insecurity, however, was buffered by a rich home life filled with thousands of books and lively political debate, providing a foundation of critical thinking and anti-fascist sentiment that would profoundly shape the young Ernesto's worldview. Long before he picked up a rifle, from a very young age, he was marked by two defining characteristics: a formidable intellect that devoured information on every subject, and a debilitating chronic asthma that would hound him relentlessly for his entire life. This severe asthma, which often left him gasping for breath, did not make him timid. Rather, it seemed to instill in him a defiant, almost reckless willpower to overcome his physical limitations. He pushed himself into aggressive sports like rugby, playing with a ferocity that stunned his peers and earning the nickname Fuser, a combination of El Furibando and his mother's surname for his aggressive style. This brilliant but physically afflicted youth eventually enrolled in the prestigious University of Buenos Aires, not to study law or politics, but to pursue the demanding field of medicine, specializing in the study of leprosy, a decision sparked by an intuitive compassion for the marginalized and the outcast of society. While his days were consumed by anatomy charts and clinical rounds, his nights were dedicated to a different, darker, and more expansive kind of education found in the family library. His intellectual influences were vast, stretching far beyond medical textbooks. He voraciously consumed the works of philosophers, poets, and political theorists. He devoured Freud on the complexities of the human psyche, Bertrand Russell on logic, and the existential dread of Sartre. But he also began to read the political theories of Marx and Lenin, alongside the sweeping poetry of Neruda and the adventure novels of Jack London, creating a complex intellectual tapestry that blended romantic idealism with a budding, hard-nosed political anger that was searching for a target and a cause. All this theoretical knowledge was abstract, disconnected from the lived experience of the masses. It lacked the grit and pain of reality. But in 1951, a single, impulsive decision would change everything, acting as the catalyst that would ignite his theoretical knowledge with the fire of experience. The adventure began in late 1951, fueled by a thirst for discovery and a desire to escape the bourgeois expectations of his life in Argentina. His companion on this quixotic quest was his older friend, Alberto Granado, a biochemist who shared his adventurous spirit and social concerns. The third member was La Poderosa, or the Powerful, a sputtering, leaky, and thoroughly unreliable 1939 Norton motorcycle that was laughably ill-equipped for the rugged terrain. Their plan was audacious, to traverse the entire South American continent, starting from Buenos Aires, heading south through Patagonia, crossing the Andes into Chile, then venturing north through the Atacama Desert to Peru, Colombia, and finally Venezuela. They set off with the romantic bravado of youth, ill-prepared but driven by an insatiable curiosity to see the continent that was, until then, just a map to them. La Poderosa lived up to its unreliable reputation, becoming a burden. The motorcycle was plagued by constant breakdowns, hemorrhaging oil and suffering countless crashes on the rugged roads. The bike finally met its end in Chile, forcing them to abandon it. This breakdown proved to be a profound blessing in disguise. No longer insulated by the relative speed and detachment of motorized travel, Guevara and Granado were forced to continue their journey by any means necessary, hitchhiking on dusty trucks, walking for miles, and stowing away on riverboats. This deceleration forced them into an enforced intimacy with the land and its people that they could never have achieved from the seat of their Norton. Stripped of their vehicle and their middle-class comforts, they saw the real South America, the continent hidden behind tourist brochures. They slept in barns and police stations, often going hungry. They encountered the dispossessed indigenous peoples of the Andes, living in crushing poverty. They worked alongside exhausted miners at the massive American-owned Chuquicamata copper mine in Chile, witnessing firsthand the brutal exploitation of workers by foreign corporations. True to Guevara's medical calling, they visited remote leper colonies along the Amazon, horrified by the social isolation imposed upon the patients, whom they famously refused to wear gloves to touch, treating them with a dignity they had rarely experienced from outsiders. This journey, documented in the Motorcycle Diaries, was unequivocally not a vacation. It was a radicalization. It was a baptism by fire. The abstract injustice he had read about now had a face and a smell. It was the face of the tubercular miner and the calloused hands of the displaced peasant. The rampant inequality between the exploited indigenous masses and the wealthy elites was no longer a classroom theory. It was a visceral, personal wound. The vast scars of the continent, its poverty, its sickness, its exploitation became his own internal scars, fueling a cold, precise rage against the systemic injustices that would define the rest of his life. He saw firsthand how the fragile machinery of a nascent democracy could be dismantled by the weight of a foreign power. This was not a theoretical lesson. It was a live demonstration of geopolitics. He observed how economic interests, specifically those of powerful North American corporations, could supersede the sovereign will of a nation. Deploying diplomatic and economic pressure to protect their profits, this experience planted a deep-seated suspicion within him, a belief that democracy in Latin America was often just a convenient label, easily discarded by the powerful when their interests were challenged, leading him to question the validity of peaceful reform in the face of such overwhelming external force. Guevara, now a qualified doctor, but driven by political fire, settled in Guatemala in 1953. It was a beacon of hope in a region of dictatorships. The country was led by democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz, a progressive nationalist enacting sweeping social reforms. Arbenz's vision was to turn Guatemala from a dependent banana republic into a modern independent state. For Guevara, this was the peaceful revolution he had hoped to see, a real-world test case for whether meaningful change could be achieved through the ballot box rather than the bullet. And he was eager to contribute. The centerpiece of Arbenz's ambitious program was Decree 900, a comprehensive land reform law that shook the foundations of the oligarchy. This law was designed to expropriate vast tracts of uncultivated land from massive estates and redistribute them to the landless peasantry. The primary target was the United Fruit Company UFC, which owned colossal swaths of Guatemala's best land, kept fallow to stifle competition. Arbench's government offered to compensate UFC based on the company's undervalued tax returns, an act the corporation saw as a direct existential threat to its business model and a precedent that could not be allowed to stand. He arrived in Guatemala in time to witness the tragic climax of its democratic experiment. In June 1954, a CIA-orchestrated coup, Operation PB Success, was launched. A proxy army invaded, supported by CIA-piloted planes bombing Guatemala City. Guevara tried to organize resistance, but the fight was hopeless. The military, intimidated by the American show of force, abandoned Arbenz. The government collapsed, and as Arbenz was forced into exile, Guevara became a marked man. He sought asylum in the Argentine embassy before escaping to Mexico, forced to flee the country that had briefly represented his brightest hope for reform. The Guatemala coup was perhaps the single most important ideological turning point in his life. It shattered his illusions about peaceful reform. He had watched a democratically elected government crushed by the United States on behalf of a private corporation. This act crystallized his conviction. American imperialism was the principal enemy of Latin America. Peaceful change was impossible in the face of such power. In the bitter aftermath, he fully embraced Marxism-Leninism as the only viable blueprint for armed struggle. The fight was no longer an abstract defense of the poor. It was a deeply personal, irreconcilable war against the United States that would consume him. Single fateful meeting in the sprawling, politically charged atmosphere of Mexico City would alter the trajectory of history. Fleeing from the wreckage of Guatemala, Guevara arrived in Mexico in late 1954, scraping by with odd jobs. He was a man consumed by a militant ideology, but without a revolution to join. It was in this vibrant community of exiles that he was introduced in July of 1955 to a charismatic young Cuban lawyer who was also living in exile, Fidel Castro, the man who would provide the outlet for Guevara's burning ambition. Castro, recently released from prison in Cuba after leading a failed attack on the Moncada barracks, was in Mexico for one reason: to assemble a guerrilla force. His objective was singular and audacious: to sail back to Cuba, launch an invasion, and violently overthrow the U.S.-backed dictator, Fulgencio Batista. Castro's movement, named the 26th of July movement, was a gathering storm, and he was seeking dedicated, hardened revolutionaries to join his seemingly impossible cause against a professional army equipped with modern weaponry. But a connection between the two men was electric and immediate. Guevara was profoundly captivated by Castro's magnetic personality, his unwavering confidence, and the sheer audacity of his plan. Castro, in turn, was deeply impressed by Guevara's intellect and his first-hand experience of the American intervention in Guatemala. They talked for 10 hours straight that first night, finding common ground in their shared anti-imperialism. Guevara, seeing in Castro the leader he had been searching for, was one of the first recruits. He joined not just as a follower, but as the group's designated medic, bringing his medical skills to the coming war. Their grand revolution, planned with such meticulous fervor in the safe houses of Mexico City, almost ended in a bloody, farcical disaster before it could even properly begin. The plan was to transport the entire rebel force to Cuba on a single, aged yacht. The group of 82 men, packed onto the leaky vessel named the Granma, sailed from Mexico in November 1956. The crossing was a nightmare of seasickness and storms. When they finally crash-landed in Cuba, days behind schedule and in the wrong location, they were met by Batista's waiting army. Of the 82 men who sailed, only a tiny, traumatized handful, estimated to be around 12 to 20, survived the initial landing and the subsequent ambush. The 1956 Granma expedition was, by any objective measure, a catastrophic military failure. The rebels landed in a swamp, exhausted and lost. Relentlessly hunted by planes and troops, the force was shattered. It was during one of these first desperate skirmishes that Guevara, faced with a choice between picking up a dropped medical kit or a box of ammunition, chose the ammunition, a symbolic moment he would later identify as his definitive transition from a healer to a warrior. A moment where the doctor died and the soldier was born. The few shattered survivors of the ambush, a desperate band that included Che, Fidel, and Fidel's brother Raul Castro, finally managed to regroup deep within the impenetrable, rugged terrain of the Sierra Maestra Mountains. This mountain range would become their fortress, their hospital, and their training ground. From these remote peaks, they were a pitifully small force, struggling against hunger and the elements, but they were alive. Crucially, they were free from Batista's immediate grasp, allowing them to begin the slow, arduous process of rebuilding their army and winning the trust of the local peasantry who had been neglected by the state for decades. It was in the harsh environment of the Sierra Maestra that Guevara forged his legend. He was far more than just the group's physician. He established himself as a strict disciplinarian, demanding absolute commitment and holding his men to an impossibly high standard. He was a patient teacher, educating illiterate peasant recruits in reading and Marxist theory. But above all, he revealed himself as a fearless and ruthless fighter, intolerant of insubordination, and quick to volunteer for the most dangerous missions, earning the respect of the hardened farmers who joined their ranks and looked to him not just as a commander, but as a symbol of the justice they craved. His capabilities did not go unnoticed by Fidel Castro. Guevara quickly evolved from magnetic to trusted strategic advisor and commander. In 1957, Castro promoted him to the rank of comandante, the first rebel to receive the title. This meant Guevara was given his own column of fighters to lead. He became one of Castro's most trusted and feared commanders, known for his tactical intelligence and his absolute, cold-blooded insistence on revolutionary discipline, which included personally executing suspected traitors to maintain the integrity of the force. The climax of his military career and the decisive Battle of the Revolution came in late 1958. Guevara was tasked with leading his Column 8 to cut the island in half. Targeting the city of Santa Clara, the odds were impossible. He led a small, exhausted, and poorly armed guerrilla force of around 300 men against a city of 150,000, which was defended by thousands of Batista's well-equipped soldiers, complete with air support tanks and an armored train sent specifically to stop him. The Battle of Santa Clara was a masterpiece of guerrilla warfare, defined by audacity and psychological brilliance. Knowing he could not win a conventional fight, Guevara focused on symbolic and strategic targets. His most brilliant move was the capture of an armored train, the TRN Blindado, which was packed with reinforcements and weapons. Using a captured bulldozer, Guevara's men ripped up the tracks, derailing the train. In the ensuing firefight, his forces used Molotov cocktails to force the entire garrison to surrender in a matter of hours, securing a massive cache of weapons. The capture of the armored train was a devastating psychological blow that broke the back of the regime's defense. The news that a small band of rebels had defeated Batista's most heavily armed reinforcements spread like wildfire. The morale of the government soldiers, already corrupt and unmotivated, collapsed. They began to surrender in droves, believing the rebels were a much larger force than they truly were. The psychological victory was total and absolute, proving that will and tactics could overcome superior firepower. The fall of Santa Clara was the final domino. Less than 12 hours after Guevara's forces seized the city on New Year's Day, 1959, the news reached the capital. Fulgencio Batista, realizing his army had disintegrated, fled Cuba for the Dominican Republic. The war was over. The revolution had won. Che Guevara, the foreign doctor who had landed in a swamp 2 years earlier, was celebrated as the architect of the decisive victory. Entering Havana as a conquering hero alongside Castro and the other commanders, the transition from rebel to ruler was immediate and absolute. The victorious rebel doctor was now assigned a new, dark, and terrifyingly powerful role. He was no longer just a soldier. He became, in the eyes of many, the chief arbiter of revolutionary justice, a position that effectively made him judge, jury, and executioner for the enemies of the new state. This new identity, as the cold inquisitor of the revolution, would come to define his public image just as much as his battlefield heroics, marking the beginning of the most controversial and bloody chapter of his life. In early 1959, Fidel Castro placed Guevara in command of the La Cabana fortress prison. This was not a symbolic post. La Cabana became the central holding and execution site for the captured members of the old regime. Guevara was given the explicit task of purging the remnants of Batista's government and his notoriously brutal secret police who had been accused of torture and murder during the war. It was a role he accepted with a chilling sense of duty. As chief prosecutor, he oversaw the trials of thousands of former officials. These were swift, summary affairs, often lacking any recognizable due process. The objective was not nuanced justice. It was a revolutionary cleansing, a settling of old scores, and a stern warning to any future counter-revolutionaries who might think of opposing the new government. The air at La Cabana was thick with the tension of imminent death. Estimates of the executions overseen by Guevara ranged from several dozen to many hundreds. The sentences were carried out immediately by firing squad against the fortress walls. Guevara was notoriously ruthless, driven by hatred for the men he saw as torturers. He made no apologies, stating that revolutionary justice was based on moral conviction. He believed these executions were a necessary sanitation to protect the new revolution from its enemies before they could regroup. This brief but bloody period at La Cabana remains one of the most controversial parts of his life. To his defenders, he was a necessary sort of justice, delivering a reckoning to the henchmen of a fascist dictatorship. To his detractors, he was a cold-blooded killer who betrayed his medical oath and established the precedent for political terror and execution that would define the Castro regime for decades to come. It cemented his reputation as the butcher of La Cabana in the eyes of his enemies. Having proven himself a tactical genius, Guevara was next tasked with rebuilding the nation's economy. The irony was that the brilliant guerrilla was a disastrous economist. The answer to whether he could run an economy was a resounding no. But the reasons for this failure lay deep within his ideological rigidity and his refusal to compromise with market forces. Despite lacking training, Guevara was appointed head of the National Bank and Minister of Industry. He was effectively the architect of the new socialist economy, philosophically enthusiastic but practically unprepared. He signed new banknotes simply with Che in a gesture that showed his disdain for money. Yet he was now responsible for managing it. Driven by ideology, he sought to rapidly industrialize the nation and sever its historic reliance on sugar, which he viewed as a symbol of subjugation to the United States. He nationalized factories and attempted to centrally plan the entire economy, setting ambitious and often unrealistic production quotas that ignored market forces and supply chains. He was obsessed with creating the new man, a socialist citizen motivated by duty, not greed. He championed moral incentives over monetary ones. He famously promoted volunteer labor, where citizens were expected to donate their time to work for the good of the revolution. He himself would participate, working topless in the fields or driving tractors, setting an example he expected all to follow, believing that consciousness could overcome economics. The results were catastrophic. Industrialization failed due to lack of materials and expertise. The crusade against sugar crippled the nation's main source of export income. The promotion of moral incentives led to widespread absenteeism and a collapse in productivity. Far from achieving independence, Guevara's policies contributed to stagnation and forced Cuba to become even more reliant on massive subsidies from the Soviet Union. Despite economic failures, Guevara became the international face of the revolution. However, as Cuba's chief diplomat, his uncompromising speeches made new enemies. He was a guerrilla, not a diplomat, and he refused to moderate his language for the delicate stage of international politics, prioritizing truth over tact. As a global ambassador, his 1964 UN speech became legendary. He blisteringly condemned American foreign policy, defended Cuban executions with the famous line, "We have shot, we are shooting," and we will continue to shoot, and championed armed revolution across the Third World, all while speaking from within the heart of his enemy's territory. He was also disgusted by the Soviet Union's perceived ideological impurity. He viewed their policy of peaceful coexistence with the West as a betrayal, accusing the Soviets of acting like just another imperial power, charging developing nations high prices for their goods, and failing to support armed struggles with sufficient zeal. His 1965 speech in Algiers was the final straw. He publicly accused the Soviets of being accomplices of imperialism. This caused a massive diplomatic rift, deeply embarrassing Fidel Castro and straining the critical Cuban-Soviet relations, at a time when Cuba was completely dependent on Soviet aid for its survival. By 1965, Guevara had become a problem. His policies had failed, and his diplomacy had alienated allies. It was too radical for the bureaucratizing state. He was a man built for war, not for governance. Restless and disillusioned, he felt the revolution had become too static. He needed a new war, a new front, and a return to the purity of the guerrilla struggle. In 1965, Guevara vanished, renouncing his citizenship. He went underground to launch a revolution in Africa. This endeavor would prove to be a complete catastrophe. It was a brutal lesson that the Cuban model of revolution was not a universal template that could be simply exported to another continent. Disguised, he traveled to the Congo to train Marxist rebels. He believed the Congo was a flashpoint for an anti-imperialist uprising. He arrived with a small cadre of elite Cuban fighters, ready to implement the tactics that had worked so brilliantly in the Sierra Maestra, expecting to find a fertile ground for revolution. The reality was a nightmare. The rebels were disorganized, fractured, and led by corrupt leaders. They were not committed Marxists. They were deeply superstitious, relying on magic to protect them from bullets, and often more interested in plunder than in liberation. They lacked any semblance of revolutionary discipline. Guevara was plunged into frustration, could not speak the language, and his strict style clashed with local culture. The operation was compromised, and they were hunted by mercenaries hired to exterminate them. After 7 months of failure and disease, Guevara was forced to flee. He described it as the story of a failure. He had gone to Africa to start a fire and had been thoroughly extinguished. His final campaign was doomed from the start. After the Congo, he planned his last endeavor. He chose Bolivia as the focal point for a continental revolution. He was a ghost, a man without a state, hunted by the CIA and Western intelligence agencies, walking into a trap of his own making. In 1966, disguised as a businessman, he launched his campaign in Bolivia. He assembled a small band of fighters, hoping to replicate the Sierra Maestra strategy, establish a base, win peasant support, and topple the government. But from the moment they began, everything went wrong. The local Communist Party betrayed him, refusing support. Far more devastatingly, the local peasants, the cornerstone of his theory, refused to join. They were suspicious of these armed foreigners who didn't understand their culture and brought war to their quiet region. The peasants actively reported his movements to the army. Guevara's group was exposed and isolated. The Bolivian government received massive support from the United States, saw a golden opportunity to eliminate their greatest enemy in the hemisphere. His band was isolated, starving, and demoralized. They were relentlessly hunted by Bolivian rangers trained by U.S. Green Berets and CIA operatives. The net was closing tight on the ailing commander, who was suffering from asthma and malnutrition, yet his will remained unbroken. On October 8, 1967, his war ended. Cornered in the Euro ravine, Guevara was wounded and captured. He was a shadow of his former self, looking more like a beggar than a revolutionary icon. Surrounded, he shouted, "Do not shoot! I am Che Guevara, and I am worth more to you alive than dead." He was bound and taken to a schoolhouse in La Higuera. It was a humiliating end for a man who had dreamed of continental liberation. He was interrogated but refused to provide intelligence. The order came from the Bolivian president to execute him immediately to avoid a public trial. On the morning of October 9, 1967, a sergeant named Mario Terán volunteered for the execution. Guevara stood up and famously told him, "I know you've come to kill me. Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man." Terán fired. The man died, but in that dusty schoolhouse, they inadvertently gave birth to the martyr. By killing the man, they launched an icon whose power would vastly eclipse the flawed human being. They had just eliminated, transforming him from a defeated guerrilla commander into a symbol of eternal youth and defiance that would adorn the walls of student dorms and protest banners for generations to come. Stripping the man of his contradictions and replacing him with a flawless, commercialized myth of rebellion.